My son told me to make myself useful and cook for his in-laws like I was hired help instead of the father who raised him. So I served that dinner in complete silence and walked away from his life forever. 35 years of loving that boy, teaching him everything I knew about cooking and life, sacrificing my own dreams to make sure he had every opportunity. And this is how he repaid me, treating me like a servant in front of people he wanted to impress. If you've ever been humiliated by your own child, if you've ever had someone you love reduce you to nothing in front of strangers, pour yourself something strong and listen close. This story's got more fire than a 5-alarm kitchen, but stick around for the ending. And if you like tales about people who think they can disrespect family without consequences, hit that subscribe button for Grandpa's Diaries. I've got more stories about finding your dignity when the people closest to you try to steal it, and how sometimes walking away is the only way to save yourself. I'm always here with fresh wisdom about knowing your worth when others try to diminish it. The evening started innocently enough. Marcus had called me that morning asking if I could come over to help with dinner for Jennifer's parents, who were visiting from Connecticut. "Dad, you know how much the Hartwells love good food," he'd said, and I was happy to help. I'd been cooking for my family since Marcus was a little boy, and some of my happiest memories were teaching him to make his grandmother's recipes in our kitchen after his mother died. I arrived at Marcus's house at 4 p.m. with my knife roll and ingredients for the beef bourguignon that had always been a family favorite. Jennifer greeted me politely but seemed distracted, busy arranging flowers and making sure everything looked perfect for her parents' arrival. "Thanks for helping out, Bill," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Marcus is upstairs getting ready. The Hartwells should be here around 6. There was tension in her voice that I attributed to normal hosting stress. When Marcus came downstairs wearing his expensive suit and cologne, he looked more like he was preparing for a business meeting than a family dinner. "Dad, I'm glad you're here," he said, but his tone was different than usual, more formal, like he was talking to a caterer rather than his father. "Jennifer's parents have very sophisticated tastes, so I'm counting on you to really impress them tonight. This dinner is important for my career advancement with Jennifer's father's company." The Hartwells arrived precisely at 6 o'clock in their Mercedes, dressed like they were attending a country club function rather than a family dinner. Richard Hartwell was tall and imposing, with the kind of confidence that comes from inherited wealth and social position. Eleanor was perfectly polished, from her designer dress to her professional makeup, and both of them carried themselves like royalty visiting commoners. They greeted Marcus and Jennifer warmly, but when I was introduced as Marcus's father, their acknowledgement was polite but distant. The conversation during cocktails made it clear that the Hartwells saw me as an interesting novelty rather than a respected family member. "Oh, you're a chef," Eleanor said when Marcus mentioned my background. "How fascinating. It must be so satisfying to work with your hands." The way she said it suggested she'd never worked with anything more challenging than a tennis racket. Richard's questions about my little restaurant revealed that Marcus had significantly downplayed my achievements as a chef who'd owned 3 successful restaurants before retiring. That's when Marcus delivered the words that changed everything between us forever. As I was preparing to start dinner service, he turned to his in-laws and said, "Dad, why don't you make yourself useful and get dinner started? The Hartwells are hungry, and we all know cooking is what you do best." The casual cruelty of reducing me to nothing more than kitchen help in front of people whose approval he was desperately seeking made my blood freeze. But the worst part was the smug satisfaction in his voice, like he was proud of putting me in what he considered my proper place. Marcus wasn't always someone who could treat his father like hired help. He was my everything after his mother Carol died in a car accident when he was only 12 years old. Suddenly, I was a single father trying to run Crawford's Bistro while raising a grieving boy who needed more emotional support than I knew how to give. Those early years were tough, but we learned to lean on each other in ways that made our bond unbreakable. Or so I thought. The kitchen became our sanctuary, the place where Marcus and I connected when words weren't enough to bridge the gap left by Carol's death. I'd bring him to the restaurant after school, teaching him knife skills and sauce techniques while we talked about his day, his friends, and his dreams for the future. Cooking his love made visible, I'd tell him while he stirred risotto or seasoned soup. Every dish is a way to take care of people you care about. Marcus absorbed those lessons with enthusiasm, proud to work beside his dad. High school Marcus was everything a father could hope for. Honor roll student, varsity soccer player, popular with his classmates but never arrogant about his achievements. He'd bring friends to the restaurant, showing off the kitchen where his dad worked and bragging about my signature dishes to anyone who'd listen. "My dad's the best chef in the city," he'd tell his girlfriend while I prepared special meals for their dates. I felt 10 feet tall when he talked about me with such obvious pride and affection. College changed Marcus in subtle ways that I attributed to normal growing up, rather than growing apart. He studied business at an expensive private university that stretched my finances, but seemed worth the investment when he graduated summa cum laude with job offers from major corporations. The expensive education introduced him to a different social class, friends whose families had country club memberships and vacation homes. I was proud of his success, but started feeling out of place at university events where I was the only parent who worked with his hands. When Marcus met Jennifer during his first year working at her father's marketing firm, I was happy he'd found love with someone who shared his professional ambitions. Jennifer was smart, beautiful, and came from the kind of established family that could help Marcus advance his career. But I noticed that Marcus started talking differently around her parents, using bigger words, name-dropping restaurants he'd never been to, and somehow forgetting to mention that his father was a chef rather than a restaurant owner. The first real warning sign came during Marcus and Jennifer's engagement party, held at the Hartwell Country Club, where I felt like a fish out of water among the lawyers, doctors, and business executives who made up their social circle. Marcus introduced me to his future in-laws as someone who worked in the food service industry, a description so vague it could have meant I was a dishwasher rather than someone who'd built 3 successful restaurants from nothing. When I corrected him and mentioned my chef credentials, Marcus looked embarrassed rather than proud. Their wedding was beautiful, but felt more like a business networking event than a family celebration. I was seated at a table with other vendors, the photographer, the wedding planner, and some distant relatives, while Marcus mingled with Jennifer's family's important friends and business associates. During his speech, Marcus thanked everyone who helped make this day possible, but he never specifically mentioned me or acknowledged the sacrifices I'd made to give him the education and opportunities that had led to this moment. I felt like a stranger at my own son's wedding, watching him transform into someone I barely recognized. The changes in Marcus became more pronounced after his marriage to Jennifer, as he worked harder to fit into the Hartwell family's social expectations and business culture. He started speaking about his background in ways that minimized my role in his success, referring to his upbringing as modest rather than acknowledging the specific sacrifices I'd made as a single father. "Jennifer's family appreciates authenticity," he'd explain when I questioned why he seemed embarrassed by our restaurant history, "but they also value discretion about personal details." My visits to Marcus and Jennifer's new house became increasingly uncomfortable, as they filled their home with expensive furniture and artwork that seemed designed more to impress visitors than create a comfortable family environment. Marcus would give me tours like I was a guest rather than his father, pointing out designer pieces and mentioning their cost in ways that suggested I should be impressed by their financial success. "We're really building something here, Dad," he'd say. But something felt more like a museum than a home. The birth of my grandson Tommy should have brought us closer together, but instead, it highlighted how much Marcus had changed since joining the Hartwell family circle. He hired nannies and enrolled Tommy in exclusive preschools, creating schedules so rigid that spontaneous grandparent visits became impossible. "We want Tommy to have every advantage," Marcus would explain when I suggested simple activities like teaching the boy to cook or taking him to the park. "The Hartwells have connections that will benefit his future." Marcus started treating my cooking skills as convenient rather than meaningful, calling me when he needed help with dinner parties for Jennifer's business associates, but never just to spend time together. "Dad, you're so much better at this than a catering company," he'd say when asking me to prepare elaborate meals for people who saw me as invisible kitchen help rather than the host's father. I was becoming Marcus's secret weapon for impressing important people rather than his beloved dad. The most painful change was how Marcus began editing his personal history when talking to his new social circle. Stories about our late-night cooking sessions after Carol died became anecdotes about learning independence early. My restaurant success was reframed as Marcus having entrepreneurial influences, rather than a father who'd built a business from scratch. He was systematically erasing me from his narrative while using my skills to enhance his reputation. Holiday gatherings shifted from our family traditions to elaborate productions designed to meet Hartwell family standards. The simple, Heartfelt meals we'd shared for decades were replaced by formal dinners with specific protocols about seating arrangements, conversation topics, and behavioral expectations. The Hartwells have certain customs, Jennifer would explain, when I asked about changes to recipes that had been family favorites for generations. I felt like I was attending performances rather than family celebrations. The final straw before the dinner party incident was Tommy's 8th birthday, where I was asked to help in the kitchen while the Hartwells and their friends celebrated with my grandson in the living room. I watched through the service window as strangers sang happy birthday to the little boy I'd been hoping to teach family recipes, while I was relegated to washing dishes and preparing food for people who saw me as staff rather than family. Marcus never once invited me to join the celebration or acknowledged that I might want to spend my grandson's birthday with him rather than in the kitchen, serving people who looked down on me. The evening Marcus told me to make myself useful was the culmination of months of subtle humiliations. But hearing those words in front of the Hartwells made something inside me break permanently. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to have integrity and respect for family, and realized he'd become someone who was willing to diminish his own father, to elevate himself in the eyes of people whose approval meant more to him than our relationship. I walked into the kitchen without saying a word, my mind racing with disbelief and hurt while my hands automatically began preparing the meal I'd planned with such care. The beef bourguignon that had once been a labor of love for family gatherings was now just a performance to impress people who saw me as nothing more than convenient hired help. Every cut, every seasoning, every technique I'd learned over 40 years of cooking felt hollow and meaningless. From the kitchen, I could hear Marcus playing the perfect host, entertaining the Hartwells with stories about his business success and Jennifer's social accomplishments. Not once did he mention that his father was in the next room preparing a meal that would have cost them $300 at any fine restaurant in the city. I was invisible to him, except as a source of culinary skill that enhanced his reputation with people whose opinions mattered more than mine. The Hartwells' conversation during cocktails revealed exactly what they thought of me and my place in their social hierarchy. "It's so convenient that Marcus has access to professional cooking," Eleanor commented to Jennifer. "Much better than hiring caterers who don't understand your personal preferences." Richard agreed, adding that family connections in service industries could be quite useful for entertainment purposes. They were discussing me like I was a resource rather than a human being. As I plated the final course, I made a decision that felt like breaking free from chains I hadn't realized were binding me. I would serve this meal with the dignity and professionalism that 40 years of cooking had taught me, but it would be the last thing I ever did for people who saw my love as servitude and my skills as convenience. Marcus had chosen his path, and now I would choose mine. I served each course perfectly, explaining the preparation and ingredients with the same expertise I'd once shared with Marcus when he was eager to learn from his father. The Hartwells complimented the food effusively, asking detailed questions about techniques and seasonings while Marcus basked in reflected glory that he'd done nothing to earn. "Your father is quite talented," Richard told Marcus, speaking about me like I wasn't standing 3 feet away. "You're fortunate to have such a useful resource in the family." The final moment came when Eleanor suggested that Marcus should bring his father to cater their next dinner party, discussing my services and availability like I was a vendor they were considering hiring. Marcus actually seemed pleased by the suggestion, nodding enthusiastically and promising to check Dad's schedule for their convenience. Watching my son treat me like a business opportunity rather than his father was the last straw in a relationship that had been dying slowly for years. I finished serving dessert in complete silence, cleaned the kitchen with the same thoroughness I'd maintained in my own restaurants, and hung up my apron for the last time in my son's house. As the Hartwells praised the meal and Marcus accepted their compliments like he'd cooked it himself, I walked out the back door and drove home, knowing I would never return to be humiliated by people who had forgotten that respect and love are more valuable than social approval and career advancement. The next morning, I began the process of completely removing myself from Marcus's life, with the same methodical precision I'd once used to plan restaurant menus. I called a real estate agent and listed my house for sale, knowing that the 3-bedroom home where I'd raised Marcus held too many memories of the son who no longer existed. "I'm looking for a quick sale," I told Janet Morrison from Morrison Realty. "I have plans to travel and I want to liquidate my assets as soon as possible." The house sold within 2 weeks to a young family who appreciated the updated kitchen where I'd taught Marcus to cook, and the backyard where we'd grilled countless dinners together. Walking through those rooms one last time, packing 40 years of memories into boxes for storage or donation, felt like performing a funeral for a relationship that had died at a dinner party where I was treated like hired help instead of beloved family. I didn't tell Marcus about selling the house or my plans to leave town. If he wanted to treat me like a service provider rather than his father, then he could discover my unavailability the same way he'd discover any vendor was no longer in business. Rosa Martinez, my neighbor who had been watching my transformation with concern, offered to handle forwarding my mail and managing any details I couldn't address before leaving. "Mijo, you're doing the right thing," she said in her gentle way. "No one should treat their father like a servant, no matter how much money they want to impress people with." Rosa had been more than a neighbor during the months when Marcus was growing distant. She'd been a friend who understood family loyalty and respect in ways my son had forgotten. A widow herself, she knew about rebuilding life after loss, and had quietly supported me through the painful realization that the Marcus I'd raised had been replaced by someone who valued social climbing over family bonds. "That boy forgot where he came from," she'd tell me over coffee in her kitchen. "But you don't have to forget who you are." The most difficult part of leaving was knowing I'd probably never see Tommy again, at least not while he was young enough to remember his grandfather, who'd wanted to teach him family recipes and share stories about his grandmother Carol. I wrote him a letter explaining that sometimes adults make choices that hurt people they love, and that his grandfather would always love him even if they couldn't spend time together. "Maybe someday when you're older, you'll understand why I had to leave," I wrote, hoping he'd eventually learn about dignity and self-respect. I deposited the check from my house sale and spent an afternoon researching destinations where a man with culinary skills could find work and adventure. Australia needed experienced chefs for resort kitchens, cruise ships offered positions for cooks willing to see the world, and several European countries had programs for Americans with restaurant experience. For the first time in months, I felt excited about the future instead of bitter about the past. The final step was changing my phone number and closing my social media accounts, making it impossible for Marcus to contact me when he eventually discovered I was gone. If my son wanted to apologize for treating me like hired help, he'd have to put more effort into finding me than he'd put into respecting me when I was available. But honestly, I wasn't sure an apology would matter anymore. Some things break so completely that all the regret in the world can't put them back together. 3 days before my departure, Rosa knocked on my door with homemade tamales and a proposition that surprised me. "Bill, I've been thinking about what you said about traveling and seeing the world," she said with a shy smile. "I have some savings, and I've always wanted to visit my cousins in Spain. Maybe we could travel together, as friends who understand what it means to start over." Looking at this kind woman who'd shown me more respect in 6 months than my son had shown in years, I realized that sometimes the family you choose treats you better than the family you're born with. 6 months later, I'm sitting in a cafe in Barcelona watching Rosa practice her Spanish with the waiter, while I plan our next destination from the travel guides spread across our table. We'd started as friends escaping painful family situations, but somewhere between the cooking classes in Tuscany and the flamenco lessons in Seville, we'd fallen in love with each other and with the freedom that comes from choosing your own family. "Where to next, mi amor?" Rosa asks, using the endearment that still makes my heart skip after all these months together. Our wedding was small and perfect, held on a beach in Santorini, with only the Greek Orthodox priest and 2 local fishermen as witnesses. Rosa wore a simple white dress she'd bought in Athens, and I wore the linen shirt she'd picked out for me in Rome. Both of us tan and happy from months of Mediterranean sun and simple living. "This is how love should feel," Rosa whispered as we exchanged vows in broken Greek and perfect emotion, like choosing joy every single day, instead of enduring obligation. The irony of my new life wasn't lost on me. I'd found more happiness with a woman I'd known as a neighbor for 2 years than I'd experienced in the last 5 years trying to maintain a relationship with a son who saw me as embarrassing rather than essential. Rosa appreciated my cooking as an expression of love rather than a convenient service, and she'd learned to prepare my mother's recipes with the same care I'd once hoped to teach Marcus. We were building traditions together instead of watching old ones die from neglect and disrespect. My cooking skills had opened doors across Europe that I'd never imagined possible. Restaurant owners in coastal Spanish towns were eager to hire an experienced American chef who could prepare both traditional dishes and international cuisine for tourist clientele. Rosa's nursing background made her equally valuable, and we'd worked our way across 3 countries by combining our skills and embracing opportunities that came from saying yes to adventure instead of no to change. The financial freedom from selling my house had given us choices that most people our age never experienced. We could afford to work for passion rather than necessity, choosing positions in beautiful locations where we could explore new cultures while contributing our skills to local communities. A month cooking for a family resort in Crete, 2 months helping in a hospital in rural France. Each opportunity taught us more about resilience and joy than years of staying in comfortable but unfulfilling situations. Marcus had eventually discovered my disappearance when he'd tried to call me for another dinner party, and found my number disconnected. According to Rosa's cousin who still lived in our old neighborhood, he'd driven to my sold house and questioned neighbors about my whereabouts, with what sounded like panic rather than concern. But I'd made sure that anyone who might have my forwarding information understood that I was starting fresh and didn't want contact with family members who'd lost the right to my time and attention. The most healing part of my new life was discovering that I could be happy without the approval or presence of people who'd taken my love for granted. Rosa and I had created a relationship based on mutual respect, shared adventure, and genuine appreciation for each other's strengths. When she cooked breakfast in our temporary kitchen in Portugal, she did it with the same love I put into preparing dinner for her. When I taught her guitar chords on the beach in Croatia, she listened with the same attention I gave to her stories about growing up in Mexico. Every morning brought new possibilities instead of old disappointments, and every evening ended with gratitude for choices that had led us away from people who'd forgotten how to value genuine love. "Do you ever miss him?" Rosa asked one night as we watched the sunset from our balcony in Nice. "I miss the son I thought I had," I answered honestly. "But I don't miss being treated like I was worthless by someone whose opinion shouldn't have mattered more than my own self-respect." Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well enough to forget why you needed revenge in the first place. 2 years later, I'm sitting on the deck of our small villa in Costa Rica, reading an email from a private investigator that Marcus hired to find me, while Rosa tends to the herb garden we planted for the cooking classes we now teach to American tourists. The investigator's message is professional and respectful, explaining that my son is desperate to reconnect and has been searching for me for over a year. According to the report, Marcus's marriage to Jennifer ended in divorce after she had an affair with one of her father's business partners, and he's apparently learned some hard lessons about choosing money over family loyalty. The investigator included a letter from Marcus that I read once and filed away without responding. My son writes about regret, about understanding now how badly he treated me, about wanting to apologize and rebuild our relationship. He mentions that Tommy asks about his grandfather, and that he's realized the Hartwell family's approval was never worth the price of his father's respect. It's a well-written letter full of the right words, but words are easy when you've lost everything and finally understand what actually mattered. Rosa reads the situation with the wisdom of someone who's also been hurt by family members who took her love for granted. "What does your heart tell you, mi corazón?" she asks while watering the tomatoes we'll use for tonight's gazpacho class. "Do you miss him enough to risk being hurt again? Or are you happy enough now to let the past stay buried?" Her question cuts to the truth I've been avoiding. I am genuinely happy for the first time in years, and I'm not sure I want to risk that peace for someone who might revert to old patterns when times get comfortable again. Our life in Costa Rica is everything I never knew I wanted. We own a small bed and breakfast where Rosa manages the hospitality, while I run cooking classes for guests who appreciate learning traditional techniques from someone who genuinely loves food and teaching. Our days are filled with meaningful work, our evenings with walks on the beach and conversations with interesting travelers from around the world. We've built something beautiful together, and neither of us takes it for granted because we both know what it feels like to be undervalued by people we loved. The cooking classes have become surprisingly popular, with repeat visitors who come specifically to learn family recipes and techniques that I once hoped to pass down to Marcus. "Chef Bill, you make cooking feel like love," one of our regular guests told me last week. "My grandmother used to say the same thing about food being a way to take care of people, but I'd forgotten until I took your classes. Teaching strangers who appreciate the gift feels more meaningful than trying to share knowledge with a son who saw my skills as convenient rather than precious. Rosa and I married legally last year in a ceremony at our local church, surrounded by the community of friends we've built in this beautiful country. Our neighbor Carlos walked me down the aisle since I had no family present, and Rosa's cousin Maria came from Mexico to stand as her maid of honor. The celebration was simple and joyful, filled with people who chose to love us rather than people who were obligated to tolerate us. "This is what family should feel like," Rosa said during our first dance to mariachi music under string lights in our garden. The question of whether to respond to Marcus's letter remains unanswered, and I'm comfortable with that uncertainty. Some relationships can be repaired after betrayal and neglect, but some wounds cut so deep that healing requires starting fresh, rather than trying to mend what's broken. Rosa reminds me that I don't owe anyone access to the peace I've found, especially people who contributed to destroying my previous peace. You can forgive without forgetting, and you can love someone without letting them hurt you again, she says with the wisdom of someone who's learned to protect her own heart. Looking back on that dinner party where Marcus told me to make myself useful, I realize it was the moment that set me free to discover who I really am when I'm not trying to earn love from people who've forgotten how to give it freely. The son who treated me like hired help did me a favor. He showed me that I deserved better treatment than I was accepting, and he motivated me to find people who would appreciate the love I have to offer. Sometimes the worst thing someone does to you becomes the catalyst for the best thing that ever happens to you. And sometimes walking away is the only way to walk toward the life you're meant to live.